welcome to Birding Basics. My name is Carolyn with the Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society, and today we are talking about the tiniest little predator you guys are going to be encountering, with feathers at least, on your walks through your parks, going out into your yard, just seeing around the city or in the hills or the forests. The Bushtits. Now, these little guys are the representatives of the Agathalidae family, which is a very long name for a very, very tiny, tiny bird. These little guys are one of about 8 species of the Agathalidae family that's found throughout the world, but we only have one representative for North America. So we get to focus on just one species today, and that's always fun. So, the Bushtit. These are very, very tiny birds, and it's not really well demonstrated in any of the pictures because, as I've mentioned, birds and scale are tricky. If you're looking in your field guide, you'll notice that descriptions include something called length, and it'll give you a description in centimeters or inches. Now, it's worth noting that these length measurements are the tip of the beak to the tip of the tail. As you can imagine, that's not a natural position for most birds. That's a measurement that's gotten off of a deceased specimen, and it's not super helpful for figuring out the actual size of the bird because it depends on the length of the tail. It depends on the length of the beak. So when you're looking at the Bushtit's length measurement, and it says 4.5 inches or 11 centimeters, and you go up the same page if you're looking at a Nat Geo, where it's sharing a page with the verdin and the chestnut-backed chickadee, you'll see that it's got the same measurement as the chestnut-backed chickadee. They're not the same size birds. The chickadee, as small as it is significantly larger, and if you're looking for a better size comparison for the Bushtits, the Anna's hummingbird is actually your friend for that. They're almost the same weight, and you know they've got just as much attitude. They're pugnacious little dudes. Something about the small size means they're just pretty dang fearless. But the Bushtit. Let's go about identifying them, figuring out what actually sets this family apart. Now, they've actually got a couple of shared features with the chickadees and the oak titmice, which, I mean, the name kind of implies that. They're sharing the tit name, which is, you know, bird families. But there's a couple of differences as well. So we'll go through the similarities and then we'll figure out what actually sets these little guys apart. So first off, these birds have strong feet. It's a really common sight once you've actually managed to get a look at these little guys as they move through the foliage, whether those are bushes, whether those are trees, tall grasses. You'll see them hanging upside down. They have zero problems with going after insects at a strange angle. They're pretty acrobatic. They're not very strong flyers, but they're more than capable of hopping from branch to branch, hanging off of leaves to get after those small insects that they're feeding on. So they're actually pretty nice to have in your garden. They're taking care of all of those bugs that might be causing your plants problems. We really like to have our insectivores around. It keeps the issue, insects and things like that, off of our plants. It means we don't have to resort to chemicals, which are very seldom good. And they're kind of cute. They're tiny, they chatter, they move around in flocks, and you generally tend to hear them before you see them. So they've got a pretty distinct call. They don't really quite have a song of their own, but this chattering is pretty constant for them, both the males and the females. Now, past the feet, those strong feet that allow them to just hang off of things, as they're going about their business. We've got their diet. I mentioned they're insectivores. Just like the chickadees and the oak titmice, these guys are going to be moving between plants, gleaning insects off of the surface. So they're not going to be prying into the bark so much. They're just picking the bugs off of the surface of the leaves, the branches, things like that. So it's surface level feeding, but they'll move through fairly quickly. And then, of course, there's the attitude. Just like the chickadees, just like the oak titmice, I mentioned these guys are pugnacious. They do not care about people. One of my favorite things about these birds is that they show very little fear towards people, and part of that is probably the size. You see this a lot with smaller songbirds. They just don't care if there's a large predator around because it's not worth the effort for the predator to go after them. They see humans the same way as they would see, for example, a red-tailed hawk. It's just, we're too large to even bother with them, so they don't care about us. Which does mean that if you're in tall grasses or if you're near a bush and the bush tits are moving through, you've got a chance to get some really good close shots of them, despite how quickly they're moving and how small they are, because they do not care. So, let's go into the differences, because there's a number of them too. They are separate families. We're not looking at another part of the Paridae family. We're talking about Agathalidae. Just super long name for very tiny birds. But these guys are social. So with our chickadees, with our oak titmice, they were territorial birds. You'd see them in mixed flocks, but only outside of the breeding season. Bush tits are social all year round. They do feed in flocks. It's not a good joke, but the rule of thumb is when you're birding and you see one bush tit, you just have to wait a minute or two before the rest of them catch up. You very seldom see just one on its own. You're looking at flocks of 6 or 7 or like 20. Handfuls of bush tits, which can get you up to a dozen pretty quickly because they're tiny. Tiny, tiny little ping pong balls made of feathers. Another difference for these little guys, and once again, very tiny, is the nest. So this is a bush tit nest, and it doesn't look awesome, but these are actually really elaborate woven sacks that they'll make. So unlike the chickadees, unlike the oak titmice, which have many similarities, they're not cavity nesters. They are going to be weaving this sack nest that hangs from a tree limb. It looks kind of like a dirty sock, to be honest, and that appearance doesn't improve throughout the nesting season. But what's great about these is while most nesting birds will only have one parent on the nest through the night while there are babies in there, both bush tit parents will sleep in the nest. And in fact, bush tits more often than not actually have adult helpers, which are actually often other males, bush tits, to help raise the young. They're insectivores. They lay a good number of eggs, around 6 or so. So it's a lot of work to keep up with feeding all of those babies. And they've got helpers. And all of those adult bush tits during the nesting season are going to be sleeping in this woven grass bag. So that's just a really cute image to keep in mind for these little guys. Once again, they're tiny. They're much smaller than the chickadees, than many of our other songbirds. This really, I've said it multiple times, but it bears repeating. These little guys are tiny, which leads to a lot of really fun things. Like you can see them supporting their weight off of really just ridiculously small leaves, twigs. It does help with their acrobatics because they are hopping everywhere. They're going after bugs at every angle. They're more than happy to just cling off of the bottom of a leaf. to get after insects, things like ants and such, and they're super, super active. So one of the tricky things about spotting a bird that's a little bit more drab like a bush tit is that you can't rely on a flash of color to draw your attention. But these guys don't like sitting still. So what'll catch your eye is actually the movement itself. Pair that with that call that they're going to be keeping up as they're communicating to each other, moving through the tree branches, and you've got a pretty reliable way to find them. It may take a while, especially if it's a little bit windier. The movement of the leaves can obscure some of their own movement, but that activity, that constant motion, does make them easier to spot than a larger bird that would have a tendency to be more still. Pair with that the fact that they don't really care if there are people there, because they don't view us as a threat to their safety. And you've got a bird you're pretty likely to spot as long as you know what to look for. Now, there are subspecies of bush tits. This is a western species, so if you're on the west coast, going into the Midwest, the western portion of it, you can spot the bush tit. We've got 3 fairly distinct geographical zones for these separate subspecies, but the bush tit subspecies are different shades of gray, and that's an unfortunate turn of phrase now. But a bush tit is going to look like a bush tit whether you are in Arizona, whether you are in California, despite the fact that you are looking at different subspecies. This isn't something like the dark-eyed junco where you look at the same bird that's technically the same species, but the subspecies look so dramatically different that you could be easily forgiven thinking it's a totally separate species that you've never seen before. It's still going to look like a bush tit. The coloration on the face is just going to be a little bit different. It may be a little bit darker on the cap. The cheek patch may be a little bit darker. And this coastal subspecies that we've got photographed here is kind of your baseline bush tit. An interesting thing about the bush tits, and one that's helpful because of how close you can actually get when you're photographing them, is the eye color is actually different between the 2 sexes. So if it has a pale, yellowish, almost white looking iris, like this little one has here, it's a female. And then if it's got a dark iris, so it looks like it has a totally black eye, it's just a really dark brown, that's the male. Now this coloration does take a while to develop. The juveniles just have fully dark eyes, so it's not 100% certain if you're in the spring during the breeding season when there are juvenile bush tits coming out of the nest and hopping around. But it's a fun thing to look for, and because you can get so close to them, like I took this picture a foot away from the bush tit. I was standing by a stand of wild fennel and a whole flock flew through and I kind of got surrounded. And they were totally content with just sitting there and watching and feeding on the bugs. So you can find bush tits in pretty much any park. They're frequent visitors to yards. Open woodlands are a really good spot for this, but there's really no wrong place to find bush tits. I don't have a specific location for finding them because they're so ubiquitous to the valley, but they're a lot of fun to watch in the field, and I realize that stills are not the best way to find them. Certainly if you look at them in your field guide, they look kind of drab. There's not a lot of excitement going on there, but the nature of how social they are and just how active they are, because they are constantly looking for food, they're constantly moving around, they're flitting around, they're hopping over each other, they're chattering the entire time. They can be a lot of fun to watch. So if you can get outside this weekend or this week, it's not a great time for bird watching because we have an apocalypse sky, But, keep an eye on the air quality, wear a mask if you go outside, and do some easy neighborhood birding, and keep an eye out for your bush tits and all of your other local neighborhood birds. Have as great of a weekend as you can manage, and I will see you all next week.